Good evening. My name is Casey Welch. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership here at the University of South Florida, and welcome to our Debatable Public Policy Event Series. This is the second of our fall semester series, and this event is on property tax reform. We have four distinguished panelists joining us tonight. Allow me to introduce them. First is the Chief Financial Officer for the state of Florida, Blaise Ingoglia. Second is former state senator, founder, and the president of the Florida Policy Project, former Senator Jeff Brandi. Also joining us is Brandi, who is the vice president for research at the Florida TaxWatch. And last but not least is Dr. Esteban Santis, who's the director of research at the Florida Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us. Just a few housekeeping items. If you see our university policy on silencing your phone and no disruptions, if you want further questions about the university policy on that, you can scan the QR code. Also, for those that are attending in person, if you see the QR codes at the end of the row, if you would like to submit a question of anything that anything that you want to ask about, but anything that the speakers may say during our first portion of our panel discussion, please use your phone to ask the question through that QR code. For those of you who are joining us online, welcome as well. There is an option to submit your questions through a QR code in the chat if you're joining us virtually. So appreciate that. And as your question or submitting those questions, we'll get to the audience question portion of the last part, and I'll take those in order as we get them. So thank you all, and we'll start with our public policy discussion. And the first question I'm going to talk about is I'm going to throw it to you, Brandi, on this first one. No, ladies first. We talked about that. So according to the Tax Policy Center, the first goal of property tax is to raise revenue for local governments to finance services. Is that the purpose of property taxes?
I think the way it is set up now is property taxes are the major source for local governments to fund critical government services is the purpose.
Okay. Any other panelists want to comment on that, about the purpose of property taxes and what their intent is?
Yeah. So as Brandi mentioned, as structured now, the Florida Constitution preempts all other forms of taxation to the state, except for property taxes and then any other tax that they allow local governments to collect via referenda. So property taxes in that sense are, I will also say there's another purpose to taxation in general, where you can use taxes to address market failure. So there are other ways that you can use taxation, but property taxes, the way they're set up now, they are nationally, they take up 30% of local government budgets. You'll get them for property taxes. In the state of Florida, your school districts are going to get 50 to 60% of revenue from property taxes. Your municipalities, 14 to 17%. Your counties, I think 18, 24%, how you're looking at it. And then you're going to have a lot of variance when you look at some counties, municipalities. Some counties are going to have more dependence. I believe Flagler County, 50% of their revenue comes from property taxes. That's so, mentioned that. Collier, Sarasota school districts, 80% of their school district budgets come from property taxes. So you have some differences there.
Mr. CFO?
I was just going to say, I think property taxes, when it was instituted, started off as a noble pursuit of trying to pay for essential services. I would argue that property taxes these days are way past its intended goal, and they're paying for things that are no longer essential. They're paying for things such as duplication and triplication of efforts. They are paying for things that probably should not be paid for by the taxpayer at all. So while a noble pursuit, I think we've gone way past the intent of what the tax was there for in the first place.
Yes, sir. Senator Brandi?
Well, I think it's important to realize that cities and counties are defined by their boundaries. And those boundaries include the properties and the people that reside in those. And so the way that Florida has set up, unlike some other states, but the way Florida has set ourselves up is that cities and counties are allowed to provide an ad valorem tax on those properties and parcels within their boundaries. That is essentially what counties and cities are. They are the boundaries by which they exist in. And so we have this reasonable and rational system that sets up a process by which we impose a tax on those parcels. It's the good thing about that is we know where those parcels are. They aren't going to move next year. It's a sustainable source. It's a regular source. It's not really subject to wild variations. And so the system that Florida's set up, unlike other systems which are set up much more on an income tax basis, is based on that simple and sustainable property system.
Yes, sir.
I just want to point out that I think the way we do property tax here, and if any other state or jurisdiction does it, it's ad valorem, right? It's according to value. And I think it is just a bad way of taxing to come up with a value as something as subjective as what someone else would pay for a property. It's disconnected from the services that it is intended to deliver.
That actually leads us to one of our next questions. According to the Florida Department of Revenue's latest property tax-based statistics, real property accounts for 94% of taxable value. In 1940, the real property accounted for 84% of all assessed property. How has this shift in that value impacted property tax reforms discussion historically, or how do you think it's going to impact the current discussion? Anyone want to jump on that one? Esteban?
Yeah, I can start. When we look at property tax that we've explained, typically you're looking at real property. Senator Brandi mentioned property that's not moving. It makes it predictable, where it is. Property shouldn't be moving, But you also have intangible property. You have property that's personal property. So there's other ways that you can tax property. It's not just the ad valorem on your real property. At one point, we had an intangibles tax in the state of Florida. We still have an intangibles tax in the state of Florida, but it's limited. In 2006, we got rid of the intangibles on stocks, bonds, and other forms of wealth that we used to levy in this state. Now, that's just an example of how the tax shift the tax burden has shifted away from, including other things like the intangibles and focusing more on real property. I do think ultimately that is part of the conversation here. Are we going to go back, or should we go back to an intangibles tax on wealth in the state of Florida? We don't have capital gains taxes because we don't have income taxes, but we do have that intangibles, and it would raise a considerable amount of money. So if we're talking about reforming property taxes, I think that could be part of the conversation. If I'm, answering that question.
Anyone want to respond to that? All right, we'll move on to the next question and talk about recently, a candidate for Florida governor that's announced stated that the funding public safety, first responder, schools, and infrastructure are the core functions of government. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that we pay property taxes for. The point of property taxes is that the voters within those boundaries get to vote on the activities of the people of the government within those boundaries. And to the extent that we're talking about a proposal that will strip out the homestead property tax exemption, what we're saying is that burden has to fall on somebody else to pay for those government services, to pay for those police, to pay for those firefighters, to pay for the schools. Who's going to pay for that? Well, I think the simple truth is renters will end up paying for it, and small business will end up paying for it. Already in Florida, 60% of your renters are rent burdened, and are paying over a third of their income in those fees, in those taxes, in that rent. And so ultimately what we run into is this proposal, which frankly is not really even a proposal. It's a bumper sticker, right? It's a bumper sticker without any policy behind it. What we've seen so far is simply a statement without any explanation of how we're going to pay for the government services beyond that, other than simply we're going to cut them out.
Sir?
I think we're starting off with the false premise and the false assumption that government actually needs all of the money that it's collecting right now. And I think there is more than enough room to cut local budgets, probably by amount of 15%, and not even worry about taking away any money for essential services. We have done our spending calculations and our audits on 10 municipalities so far, and counties and municipalities, and we found $1.5 billion of what we are terming excessive and wasteful spending. So I think there is more than enough room to cut. And look, the fact of the matter is that government, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of a lot, should not be growing faster than inflation and population growth. But what we are seeing is these local jurisdictions are blowing past that number, spending a lot more money than they should. In fact, you can make the argument as a population grows that the cost per resident should actually be going down because you're going to take advantage of economies of scale. As more people move in, the cost per resident should go down, where in businesses, the cost per unit actually goes down. That's how some of these large companies, these mega companies, make their money on economies of scale. Government just keeps on growing linearly. So when we are discussing property tax reform, let us please first acknowledge that they are taking in an obnoxious amount of money compared to what they used to be. And here's another data point. And this is why this discussion is so important right now. When the homestead exemption in Florida was originally put into place, $25,000 homestead exemption, it shielded about 33% of your home from taxation. That number is closer to 9% right now. And that's why we're having this discussion, is because the system that we have of homestead exemption and ad valorem is outdated, it's not working, and regular residents and Floridians are feeling the pinch. And the only one who's benefiting is government.
Anyway, you want to respond, Brandi?
We agree that critical government services should continue and not be eliminated or compromised. And we think that has to be part of the conversation when looking there. I think we've looked at some local governments and it doesn't seem like there's a standard set of service benchmarks, requirements, or even where they are. A lot of ones we looked at just budget off of a 10% increase over last year. So we think there are some best practices that can be put into place in conjunction with a property tax reduction elimination.
Okay, Esteban.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about, is government doing what government's saying it's doing? So is it effective? Is government doing it in the most optimal way? Is it efficient? And is it doing it equitably by taking into account the needs of different populations? I definitely think there's always going to be room for improvement, and we should figure that out. And respectfully, and I haven't seen the audits, so I can only speak to what I understand to be the formula. If we look at something like inflation plus population, I think intuitively it makes sense, but we have to remember what inflation, the way that we talk about it, is. See, if we're using something like the consumer price index, typically that's a basket of goods. We'll talk about it like that. We'll talk about it in the price of eggs, milk, bread. But the thing is that government expenditures are different from your household goods. They're not the same type. They might overlap when you look at energy costs, gas, fuel, but typically we don't think of government going to the store to pick up eggs. What they're doing is that they're paying for teachers, they're paying for law enforcement, they're paying for sanitation, they're paying for emergency services, and then they're paying the personnel costs, the fringe benefits, to all of that, pensions. The costs start to add up. I think you can use measures of inflation if you're adjusting for those specific items that are going to be spent more at the local level. And then the other thing with population is population growth does give you a decent metric, but it doesn't tell you the cost of the specific types of population. The needs of a 65-year-old are going to look very different from the needs of a 4-year-old. And what we do know is that by 2030, 1 in every 4 Floridians will be over the age of 65. And it makes sense for us to know where those populations are and how much that's going to cost. So I think there are adjustments you can make to the formula. Could we use something like just value plus population and inflation? Should we look at personal income, which we do at the state level? There are things you can do. Again, I haven't seen it, so I don't know exactly if those limitations are addressed.
So what I would say to that is that the people that you're asking to fund government are having it tougher in terms of affordability because of inflation. It is abhorrent to me that we are asking the people who are suffering because of inflation to then fund government because government is then suffering from inflation. In addition, when we talk about population, almost every jurisdiction that we've looked at has a family of 4 moving into any of these jurisdictions. They have increased the budget anywhere between $20,000 to $50,000 for a family of 4, which means they're just taking the extra money and expanding government. There's no other way to put it. They're just taking the excuse of population and taking in this extra money. Now, with every population increase, you are going to have certain metrics. You are going to have additional fire and additional police because those are population centric. Those are directly derived to population. But I made this joke before, and it's a joke, it's an analogy, but I hold it to be true. It's almost like a bureaucrat will sit, or a government worker will sit at a table, and all of a sudden a piece of paper drops on their desk with something more to do, and then they're like, we'll just hire 10 more people. Government hardly ever thinks about restraining itself and start realizing that they are asking other people to fund that instead of becoming more productive. How do you become more productive? Become more productive in general. There are things that you can purchase. AI, I think, is going to be a big thing going forward, where we can actually have some efficiencies attributed to that. But at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of either legislative restraint or constitutional restraint. We can ask for best practices all day long, but unless it is in law or unless it is in the Constitution, government is going to continue to grow, taking extra money and expanding it.
Senator Brandi, do you want to comment on that before?
Well, I mean, I think this is a challenge with the current plan, right? The current plan that's on the table is cutting homestead property taxes. This is not a plan that's been deeply researched. The governor went out and vetoed the money that was supposed to be set aside to research this plan. Why did the governor veto it? We don't know. I think he vetoed it because he didn't want to have to scope the plan. Any type of research is going to have to require a scope. Any type of scope that he would have put out would have been debated, would have been challenged. And yet the CFO has to sit in here and defend this plan that is not a plan. It's a bumper sticker slogan. At the end of the day, what we're faced with is I will fully admit Tallahassee is bloated and cities and counties are bloated. And can they go on a diet? A little bit? Yeah, sure they can. I'm glad the CFO is sitting here pointing it out. But to say that the only way that we're going to cut taxes is by cutting homestead and not talking about the rest of the formula, I'm just giving you the result. I'm not giving you how we get there. And this is the problem I have with this overriding plan. There is no explanation of how we're going to get there. There is no, okay, and then what happens? All right, are we going to cut police and firefighters? No, they say we're not going to do that. Are we going to double the sales tax? Maybe. Are we going to watch cities and counties bump up their millage on renters and small business owners? Likely, because most counties are not at the top of their millage. And so what we aren't hearing is what comes next. You're only hearing, and on purpose you're only hearing, we're only going to cut the property taxes on homesteaded properties. They don't want to tell you what comes next. And this is my problem. You deserve transparency. You deserve accountability. And what this plan does is it removes transparency and it removes accountability. I don't pay the sales tax anymore. I don't pay the property tax on my homestead anymore. What is my accountability to then go with my pitchfork to city and county government and demand that they remain accountable? Because now I'm disconnecting that homeowner from the outcome, which is the tax proposal that cities and counties raise.
Esteban, I think you were going to make a comment a minute ago.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think the CFO is right. If you look at, I think nearly 50% of Florida households are struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling with the cost of daycare, cost of health, cost of rent, house, and then you have taxes on top of that. We do have the most inequitable tax code in the country. This is true at the state level and this is true at the local level. However, we do need, I think there are some nuances when we talk about the property tax code specifically. We do have limits in place for property tax code. It's called Save Our Homes. If you bought your home 10, 15, 20 years ago, you've been protected from these skyrocketing changes in market value. I think, I haven't checked the figure, but I know the CFO mentioned, homesteads now only take about 9%. If you look at Save Our Homes, you're looking at a 30 to 40% cut on top. So if you add up the exemptions we have, Save Our Homes benefits, plus your homesteads, you're talking about individuals who are getting a 50% discount on their property taxes, which is what they were made for. Perfect. But if you're a first-time homeowner, if you're trying to get first-time home buyer, if you're in the market out there, you are going to be paying higher property taxes than your neighbor. That is horizontal inequity. We've known we had that, and we haven't addressed that. So that's another part of this conversation that we should be having. Not everyone's feeling the strain of property taxes the same. What are we doing for the first-time home buyers, the individuals who are trying to get into a home, who are competing with individuals who have 50% deductions, benefits?
Let's dive into the numbers a little bit more. If policymakers were to eliminate property taxes and replace them with a higher consumption tax, like sales tax, how much would lawmakers have to increase the state's general sales tax rate to make up for that loss? I know you all have studied some of that.
So about 1% is equal to 6.8 billion.
Okay.
EDR puts that number out. So if homestead, we're looking at about 19 billion statewide of homestead levies, ad valorem levies. So that could equal about a 2.8% increase in the sales tax, if that's what you're looking at 1-to-1.
Okay.
But also, I do want to point out that I think the numbers that were quoted, MB2 would be 43, which I think is incorrect. I think it's closer to $55 billion of what the total ad valorem collection.
Right.
So if you got rid of that, the sales tax would have to double. But nobody's advocating for getting rid of homestead. Excuse me, property taxes altogether. It's only the homesteaded properties. So, and this is where I think, and Senator Brandis is right. You know, there should be a plan, and I know that the Office of Management, the budget under the governor's office is running some numbers. I know the House is running numbers. I know the Senate is running numbers. But the portion that we're talking about is roughly about $20 billion, with about $11 billion of that being school taxes. So, and we also have to factor in that all counties are not the same. There are some counties where almost 90%, the small rural counties where all of their money is coming from ad valorem. And there's about 29, what we would call fiscally constrained counties. If you added up all of the the homesteaded property taxes for those that they yield, that's about $330 million. And the governor is right. That is something that we could totally come out and the state could cut a check for that. So now we take away 29 fiscally constrained counties from that. Then we're left with the rest of the counties. The larger counties, actually, it is much easier, believe it or not, the Miami-Dades, the Broward, the Orange, which have a lot of commercial investment in it, commercial buildings, multifamily buildings. They are deriving their homesteaded properties are only paying about 17-18%. So it's a much smaller number on those bigger counties where they could technically go to referendum, increase the sales tax in those counties by 1%, supplement some of that, but they can also right-size their budgets and reduce some of that. The challenge, I think, comes in is the mid-sized counties, the counties in between 250 to maybe 600,000 population, where we would have to find the numbers and strike that balance. But you were bringing up the statewide increase, right? So as the state of Florida continues to grow at a 6% sales tax, we have found ourselves yielding huge surpluses. Surpluses that we're putting away for rainy day funds. I think there's an opportunity there where the growth itself, the organic growth in the state of Florida, can help fund and reduce some of the burden on homesteaded property owners in the state of Florida. And all of this does not have to be done in one election cycle, in 1 year. It is something that can be phased in over time to have governments understand how they can get to the point where zero property taxes on homesteaded properties can be realized without increasing the burden on commercial properties, industrial properties, and multifamily properties at the same time. But at the end of the day, we have to restrain spending on the local level. And even if you have, let's say, an increased ad valorem homestead property exemption, the counties and cities are just going to find another way to replace that revenue. So unless we have some sort of spending restraint, similar to what Colorado is doing with the Tabor, this is just an exercise in nothing, because cities and counties will find a way around it and tax its citizens.
2 points, if I can follow up. CFO mentioned about smaller counties, and there were some comments recently in the press that maybe some smaller counties should consider combining to spread that tax burden. Any comments on those types of thoughts?
Horrible idea. I think it is a horrible idea.
Anybody else? Senator Brandi?
Well, I mean, I think what you find is the cities and counties now have to come to the state legislature every year with their bowl of gruel and ask for more. And I think this is the challenge that you've wasted. The legislature doesn't want to get involved and have to allocate to how many firefighters each of these small counties have, how many police officers they have. That's the last thing they want to get involved in. And yet this is what they're going to ask them to do. Come up with an annual formula that will fund this. Well, here's the simple truth about the state budget. They have money this year, But you know what? 27, 28, they're $1.5 billion in the hole. 28, 29, they're $6.6 billion in the hole. So where are we going to find the $300 million that we need to fund local government when we already have to talk about what we're going to do to fill the $6.6 billion hole? This is the fallacy of this conversation. We've already heard tonight, listen, the burden's going to fall on multifamily properties. That's going to fall on small business and commercial properties. We've also heard that the burden is probably going to fall on local governments to be forced to raise sales taxes. And we've already heard that the sales tax would have to increase. I think you said 2.9 cents, not percent, cents, in order to reach parity. So what we end up with is renters pay more in property taxes, and then they go out and pay more in sales tax. Yet the homeowners now would pay nothing for their properties. How is this fair? Especially on Main Street, especially on the most cost-burdened people that we have. I'm all for having a discussion about property taxes. I'm all for having a discussion about cutting property taxes. But what we're talking about, what the governor's proposed, I don't blame the CFO, but the governor's proposed is totally an illusion. He refuses to put out a plan. He's had a year. His first plan was, let's just give everybody $1,000 tax break. And now it's evolved into, well, let's just cut all homesteaded property taxes. But again, like in college, sometimes your professors ask you to show your work. And what he's refused to do to date, and I hope he does it, is show his work. Tell us how we're going to get there.
Brandi, I know you were going to jump in a minute ago, but do you want to comment
Just
back
back
on
to
that?
the
Yeah.
consolidation, and not in favor of consolidation, but maybe, the 411 municipalities, have they looked at purchasing power combining? Is there some sort of efficiencies that neighboring cities can combine and get better purchasing power?
Esteban?
Oh, yeah, just to highlight, we double if you were to eliminate all property taxes, but really the Florida Chamber, I think the Chamber came up with a white paper on property taxes, and their estimate is that it would have to be closer to 14%, so more than double. For just the homesteads, I think their estimate is around 8.8%, so that's on par with what we mentioned, but then you have to add in local taxes that you already have. So some localities are already paying a penny tax, so you add that on top. So we're talking about 9% sales tax, 10% sales tax, which will hit low to moderate income families the hardest. If you're making under $62,000, this is going to hit you the hardest. The underlying thing here is that the proposal itself to eliminate is a cost shift. Either you raise sales taxes, as we've mentioned, or you're increasing fees, which are another way to raise revenue at the local level, or the chamber said corporate income taxes would have to increase by 10 times, tenfold, to make up the difference. It is a cost shift because ultimately, who's paying for this? That's the question. Someone's going to have to pay for this. I think public budgeting, you have to have balanced budgets. We're not the federal government. We have to have a balanced budget at the state level, and we have to have a balanced budget at the local level. If you cut a key revenue source, you're going to have to make up for it another way. And to the CFO's point, you could find some ways to make government more efficient, but that's not going to cover the 18.5, $19 billion you need. I say 18 because EDR, the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, they looked at this proposal to eliminate property taxes on homesteads, and their estimate, their recurring costs around $18 billion just for the homesteads, not including schools.
But they are all deriving their numbers on the assumption that government needs all of the revenue that they're taking in right now. And I'm telling you, they're taking in more, way more money than they're expected to. So just going back to our calculation, there's one county that we are going to be rolling out an audit relatively soon, where if you count inflation and population, their budget should have reasonably, general fund budget, the portion of the budget that is funded by their property taxes, should have gone up reasonably around 33%. It went up 90%. That is one of the most obnoxious, egregious amount of overspending that we see. So when we're talking about adding sales tax, and when Amy Baker and EDR is doing all these calculations, they're working off of a false assumption that they actually need that money, all of the money that they're taking in right now. And I would say no, not even close.
Let me follow up on this. So just for a policy discussion, should any of these proposals out there include identification of new sources of revenue, or are those separate? Do you think those are separate conversations? It's not just for you, for anybody on the panel.
Yeah, I think they're separate conversations. But again, if you are going to have additional sources of revenue, if you are going to do something like an MST or an MSBU at the local level, there has to be some sort of either constitutional restraint or legislative constraint to prevent governments for taking advantage of the taxpayers. And that's what we've seen specifically over the last 5 years. Look, we've gone through this exercise before. This is nothing new here in the state of Florida. We've gone through this in the mid-2000s. We had a rise in property values, a rise in property taxes. People were very angry at government at the level of taxation, and they voted for an additional property homestead exemption. Now, I argued back then that the way we were doing it, we were eventually going to have this problem in the future, and now here we are again. And that's mostly because the homestead exemption that was added created this really weird structure with donut holes, and it was never indexed for inflation or inflation to begin with. I would have much rather seen 20 years ago, instead of having the structure that we have right now, $175,000 property tax exemption that indexed and went up every year. So as property values gone up, you had the corresponding increase in homestead exemption, which would have then constrained government spending somewhat.
Any other comments?
I think it's worthy of a study. Unfortunately, that study was vetoed. I mean, at the end of the day, we should lay out all of the possibilities. We have 5 research institutions in Florida, right? The major research institutions. Well, they should be doing studies on this. There should be, we should look to fix this patchwork quilt of property tax exemptions that we have granted over the last, decades. And this is the challenge Florida faces, right? We have inherited our forefathers' tax plan, and we're now building off this. The people who are angry, I think it's important to note, the people who are angry about property taxes are not the people who have been living in their homes for 20 years. Generally, they've had the benefit of homestead exemptions. But if you bought during the pandemic and now you're paying the full fare, those are the people who are up in arms. And I understand that. But we also have people in Palm Beach whose property tax exemption is over $100 million of taxable value. How is that fair? That's where the state has ended up. This huge diversion in what is, there's a famous road built on good intentions. And I understand the intentions that the forefathers had when they put the property tax exemptions into place. But that has not played out equally or fairly across Florida by any stretch. I totally support the CFO's audits of these communities. I hope that they are transparent. I hope they will lay out for people. And people should be upset when they see excess government spending. But this is why we have accountability. This is why you pay taxes. So you have the right to stand in front of your local governments and demand that they be more accountable with your services and be more accountable with the resources they receive. If we strip away those taxes, then, and it's all in the sales tax or it's all paid by renters, I mean, I think that's something totally different.
Mr. CFO, did you want to respond to that?
I was just going to say, if we went back to the original idea of the homestead exemption shielding about 33% of your home from taxation, we would be in a much better place than we are right now.
Okay, Esteban?
Again, this is true. Like Senator Brandi mentioned, if you bought your home in the last 5 years, you're not getting that benefit. But if you bought your home 10, 15, 20 years back, you do have that 40 to 50% benefit, lowering your assessed value from your market value. So that is there. There is inequity that's built into it, but we have that. Second, the original question was, should we have proposals to raise revenue? I think we should, because in public budgeting, you have to have balance. So if you're proposing to make the significant cut, you should because ultimately, the voter will have to decide. If this goes to, we have to change the Constitution, so Floridians will have to decide. They should know what the options are for the cost shift. And they should know the pros and cons. Here's a con. If I ask everyone in this room, tell me how much you pay in sales taxes this year. Odds are most of you couldn't tell me, but if you have property taxes and I asked you how much did you pay, you'd know. That obviously makes it so that you don't like property taxes because you know exactly how much you're paying, but it is transparent. And then you can, there are mechanisms levers you can pull to, debate or contest your adjustment, your adjustments, assessments. There we go. There's different things you can do. But if you shift away from property taxes to sales taxes, you are losing transparency and you're losing the ability to hold governments accountable. Are property taxes perfect? No. But I do think if we're making the proposition of eliminating them, we need to have full transparency about what will increase and how will that impact the taxpayer.
Brandi, did any of the TaxWatch proposals address that issue that in your all's report? Just talking about the revenue sources. I know you looked at the sales tax number because you mentioned it before.
No, we talked about that until you figure out what local governments are spending and on what and what they need, that I think we feel comfortable saying you don't need one-to-one replacement, but we don't know that answer. I think that's a big part of the equation that we don't know right now.
Senator Brandi, did you want to comment?
Well, I think this highlights the major challenge with this proposal, right? Which is, at the end of the day, the governor won't be there to implement it. He doesn't have to eat his own cooking on this one. And this is what I think is the greatest injustice here, is he gets to drop this on the next governor and say, you deal with it. He doesn't want to talk about what taxes he has to raise, right? When you're planning to run for president in 28, you want to talk about everything you cut and nothing that you raised. And this is where we find ourselves. And at the end of the day, the next governor is going to have to deal with it. Local cities and counties are going to have to deal with it. And the legislature is going to be forced to have this conversation about what they want to raise in the future. And they don't want to talk about that. And so this is overridingly the kind of in the back of everybody's mind, at least in Tallahassee, I think, the challenge that we face, which is we're going to have to, if we deal with this in 26, and it goes on the constitutional amendment, it doesn't actually go into effect really until 27 or 28. And then what happens? Well, in 27 and 28, we're facing $1.5 billion in 27 and a $6.6 billion deficit in 28. And then has a wild, disparaging impact on different cities and different counties, because as the CFO said, cities and counties are all over the board about how much revenue they actually receive from homestead and property taxes. And so some of them, it will be a minor hit, and some of them, it'll be a club upside the head.
CFO.
Just a couple of other points here when we're talking about reducing property taxes, because there is a disproportionality of somebody who's been in a home for 20, 30 years because of Save Our Homes and somebody entering the market right now. And the people who are entering the market that I'm very concerned with is your first-time home buyers. People in between 20 and 35 right now. Good luck trying to buy a house right now, because housing affordability and the idea of home ownership and the American dream is just beyond a lot of people here now because of that. So reducing the burden on your principal interest, taxes and insurance payment that you're paying out is disproportionately hurting new home buyers. So they are not entering the market. So what we are doing here, in the absence of wholesale property tax reform, whether reform is getting rid of homesteaded properties getting rid of property taxes on homesteaded properties altogether, or serious reform that is long lasting where we're offering releases, we are creating a nation of renters with our next generation. And not only are we doing that, it is a time where it is much cheaper to rent than it is to buy right now. So people are making decisions based upon their finances, saying, hey, it does not make sense for me to buy right now, I'm going to rent. So now all of a sudden you have an over demand for the rental market. And who is filling that void? Hedge funds and Wall Street, buying up our communities because they are taking advantage of the delta between what can somebody afford for rent and what somebody can afford for homes. And they are finding that they can purchase these homes, they can rent them out, and they can get a greater yield than what they're getting buying bonds on Wall Street. So if you fix the issue with property taxes and get property tax reform, you actually help alleviate the problem with Wall Street banks buying up our communities. In addition, one other point that I want to make to my good friend Senator Brandi here is that with the exception of the years when we were dealing with the Great Recession, I don't think those economic forecasts ever come out have actually hit their numbers. They've been forecasting negative numbers for decades, and we've always had surpluses.
Go ahead, Esteban.
I believe market values have jumped in the last 10 years, have jumped up by 155%. Eliminating property taxes is not going to help that first-time home buyer get into a home if they don't have enough for a down payment. If you look at the National Realtors Association, they came out with their study looking at, okay, what are the factors that are making it so that the age for first-time home buyers now is what, 40? In Florida, I think it's 42. So if you're looking to get a home and you're a student 20 years from now, you look at those factors. What is it? Student loans, daycare, the other cost. They're not property insurance. They're not necessarily mentioning property taxes as the main inhibitor of them getting into a home. Like I said, just values have jumped up by 155%. You can get rid of property taxes tomorrow. It'll be a cost shift, but I don't think it's going to get more first-time home buyers into the market.
So
Yes, sir.
first of all, the data shows, and this goes back 50 years, that it's always the biggest impediment to purchasing a home is down payment. So nothing has changed now than it has 50 years ago. But I would also remind you that a lot of the issues that we're having with affordability issues, whether it be childcare, whether it be insurance, whether it be property tax, housing, those are things that government are intricately involved in. So I would argue that government itself is inflationary, and they are driving a lot of the issues that we have with affordability. It's government itself. The more we actually wrap our heads around that, the better we will be, not only as a state, but as a nation.
Go ahead, Esteban.
Or counter argument, just for conversation's sake, government's not doing enough to help with affordable housing. From 2009 to 2019, the state of Florida rated our affordable housing trust funds $2.5 billion that were never returned. That would have gone to affordable housing. In 2021, the state liquidated the Law and Child's Endowment Fund. That was money for children's healthcare. It had to do with tobacco, but really it was for children's healthcare. That money, first of all, they had rated that trust fund, and then it went into the Budget Stabilization Fund. There's $1 billion from money that should have been spent on children that's sitting in reserves right now. So I think a counter argument would be that government's not doing enough.
Senator Brandis?
Yeah, I mean, I want to stay focused on the property tax issue because I think this is the challenge. I think what the CFO says is, look, people at the end of the day will be able to buy first-time homes. The challenge with that is there will be a gold rush of people from around the country that want to move to Florida to shield taxes. And so what ends up happening? It isn't Floridians that are now competing for first-time homes. We're competing with all the New Yorkers who are coming down here, and all the people from Connecticut, and all the people from all these other states that want to move to Florida to shield their taxes. And they pay no state income, and now they pay no property tax. So it isn't the renters who are struggling to find that down payment for their first home that are going to get access to this. It's the simple truth is that we will have a burden on supply. Demand will increase because you're getting this huge benefit by having a homesteaded property in Florida. And ultimately it will continue to drive prices of first-time home buyers up.
I want to make 2 points before we get into audience questions and say, number one, our last debatable series was on affordable housing. If you have any more questions about that, go to our website and check that out. We had 4 incredible experts like these folks up here talking about that exact issue. So a really spirited debate. And the second thing is, as we get into audience questions, I want to remind you to use the QR codes at your seat if you're joining us here in person, and those online, please use that option online to submit your questions. We have a robust amount of questions I'm going to be wading through as I ask this last question from our prepared remarks to the panel. We talked about several of the proposals in passing that the legislature is looking at. Most of them, 99.9% of them, are constitutional amendments. However, there's a proposal to cap the required local effort at $10 billion, which would be an immediate reduction from the current figure, and committing to never exceeding that amount. And then the second part of the proposal is that to decrease it $1 billion each year over the next 10 years. So this single item would represent 25% of the total property tax collections statewide, and phasing it out does not require a constitutional amendment. So is that a more straightforward solution to get at what we're talking about? Anyone jump on that one?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say it is a solution.
A solution, okay.
It is an outside the box solution. And I think that's what we need is we need to think of alternative ways to make the glide path so we eventually get to the aspirational goal of no taxes on homesteaded properties.
It just doesn't make a very good bumper sticker.
It's a little clunky. Go ahead, Esteban.
Well, who's paying for it? I think Sarah Brand has mentioned in 2 fiscal years, you have what, 1.5 billion. In 3 fiscal years, you have a 6.6 billion deficit if the state continues spending and budgeting the way that it has done without raising revenue. If you start cutting and require local effort, sure, how is the state going to make up for that? And I know there was mention of the reserves. We do have reserves, but we also have to remember that over the past 5 years, we had a lot of money flowing down from the federal government. We had money going down to state, local governments, as well as individuals, which helped with consumption. We have a consumption economy. It wasn't the entire thing. There was also the liquidation of Law and Childs and other things that went into these trust funds. That money is... We're not going to see those levels of trust funds again. We're not going to be building up. It's different. You shouldn't be. I shouldn't be kind of speculating here. I don't know what's going to happen, but I would put money down that we're not going to have those level of reserves again. So who's going to pay for this? Is it going to be a state level increase in sales taxes? How are we paying for that to take off some of the burden from the local government and putting it onto the state?
Mr. Sipa.
I want to bring up a point because you made a very good point is that local governments were seeing a huge amount of influx from the federal government post-COVID. And what has happened, and this is pretty much undeniable, is that local governments have taken all this extra money and expanded government. They, instead of it going directly to people and programs that were already in place, they were expanding programs and they were adding new programs. But then local government pretty much got lucky, is that everyone moved here in the COVID era, boosted up demand, and we saw an increase in property values and a corresponding increase in property taxes. So local governments knew that the gravy train from the federal government was going to end and there was going to be a finite portion to that funding. But then it was supplanted and exceeded by local government revenue in the form of property taxes. So they just continued expanding some of these governments. But here's another point I want everyone to understand when we're talking about property taxes and what I'm discussing here and where I'm coming from. I think I've already said that I don't think that our property tax system, which is ad valorem according to value, is the optimal way of doing it because it is totally disconnected from the services that you were trying to provide, the essential services in the community. So if we started off in 2019, and let's say we never had a real estate boom, we never had an increase in property values, we never had an increase in property taxes, but we did, however, have normal budget government growth due to inflation and population, your budget would be at a certain amount, about 30 to 34%, depending upon where you live in the state of Florida. But a lot of these governments were growing in between 60 to 100%. The only reason why that extra money was there was because of an increase in property values. If the property values would have never gone up, they would have had to live with an increase in the general fund budget of between 30 to 34%. So I don't agree with the fact that local governments need all of that money. I will continue saying that they need all that money because if it wasn't for the increase in property values, they would have had much lower budgets to begin. So when we have these discussions, I will continue saying this. Let's not start off with the faulty assumption that they need all this revenue because they absolutely don't. They were good before, they were good also. And look, we've gone through this. In the mid-2000s, local governments were taking tax dollars, mind you, and going out and waging campaigns and using those tax dollars, making an argument and a marketing campaign why you should pay higher taxes and you shouldn't get a higher homestead exemption. But at the same time, if you remember, in the 2000s, after we had the Great Recession, we got an additional property tax exemption, $25,000 property exemption. Part of that was exempted for schools, right? So when you blend it all together, it's in between 39 to 41% of what you're actually getting in terms of an exemption. But at the very same time, for the first time in history of the United States, you had a recession, a reduction in property values. So local governments got actually hit twice. They got hit twice with the reduction in revenue because of an additional homestead exemption. And at the same time, they had a reduction in property values. And government survived. It will do again.
Let me go to Brandi first, and then I'll go to you. Esteban.
In support of the CFO, the values are driving it, and local governments can take advantage of the increasing values and not raise millage rates. We see a minority of counties lowering the rollback and just keeping millage the same, which under law is a tax increase, has to be advertised, but it's the same rate. So it doesn't look like a tax increase, but they're bringing in millions of more dollars.
Billions.
I think it was billions with a B. Esteban, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so CFO is right. I mean, if you go back to, the 70s, that's when we had widespread property tax revolt across the country. That's where you get some changes out of California. In Florida, we had Save Our Homes in 1992. It gets implemented in 1995. You had the dot-com bubble after that. In the mid-2000s, so history here. You go in the 90s, you make a change. All right, we solved it. Make some cuts. Mid-2000s, same thing. You go in, you make some cuts again. Okay, we've solved it. No, you didn't, because then you have the Great Recession, as the CFO mentioned. Governments were hit. Now, I think there is some debate here as to whether governments were fine. We saw reduced service times. We saw people losing their jobs. I mean, were people really receiving the same standard and quality of services that they were before? EDR does, if you look at their kind of economic products, they would say that a lot of those local governments had not recovered by 2019 from the Great Recession. So I think it depends on how you look at it, right? But mid-2000s, we made some changes and then we got hit with the Great Recession. The question here is, are we measuring twice and cutting once? Or are we just going to do this thing again where we're making some big cuts and we're going to have to come back in 20 years or 10 years to fix it?
But I think that's why property tax reform is so crucial. We cannot put another Band-Aid on this, because 20 years from now, we're going to have the same problems. We're going to have the same discussions.
Let's jump into audience questions here, and these are in no particular order, whether they've come in online or in person. So I'm going to start with one question that talks about how you all are clearly experts and appreciate you serving on the panel. But the question really has to do with how you think that term limits for state elected officials affect this problem in the lens upon which those termed out approach this. And I think Senator Brandi, you touched on that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think Florida is in a unique situation where term limits are too short. I wrote an op-ed on this. You can look it up on the challenge of Florida's term limits. The issue is not so much term limits. It's the fact that our leadership in Florida is only there for 18 months, really. For 2 years total, but 18 months where they're effective because there's a session going on. No other organization, frankly, that I know of, other than maybe your high school student council, runs on an 18-month leadership cycle, right? Certainly not any major business. This isn't like Tesla is going to swap out its CEO every 18 to 24 months. You would call that chaos. But yet Florida, which is the 14th largest economy or 19th largest economy in the world, switches out our speaker and our Senate president every 18 months. Like, I spent 12 years in Tallahassee. My big takeaway after those 12 years is everything in Tallahassee is tactical. There is no strategy. You want to know why we don't have a housing strategy? It's because we think in 18-month increments. You know why we don't have a larger strategy on taxing? Well, it's because we really think in 18-month increments, because our leadership thinks in 18-month leadership increments. If you want to make one strategic change to the Constitution that will have lasting impacts for Florida, go to 12-year term limits and 8-year and 4-year speakerships and Senate presidencies. Let them run with the governor and at concurrently, let their time periods run with it concurrently. It'll take away the power shift and the power struggle that happens in between the governor and the speaker and the Senate president, because they'll be forced to work together and not just wait each other out.
I see a possible debatable topic here in the future. We could talk a little bit more about that. I'm sorry, any else want to comment on that question before we go to the next? Okay. Another question that came in from the audience was, should we switch to the land value tax rather than property tax to shift the tax burden from the poor people, those who need to make their home safer, to the richest? Sorry, that was the way it was written. Anybody want to? I guess it's talking more about taxing the actual valuation as opposed to just a general property tax. But I think that's what the assessor does. So let me get some other ones here. Let's see. How about, should we propose a vacancy tax to correct arbitrarily high rents?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to get through some of these. Let's see. By taking away property taxes, adding sales taxes, are you not just making life easier for generally more wealthy homeowners and harder for generally less wealthy renters? I know we've talked about that a little bit. Any
Yes.
comments? Yes.
Yes.
Usually we don't get yes or no's up here, especially with these kind of experts here. So there's several questions about property taxes in relation to homeowners insurance. Anybody want to take those?
I mean, the insurance industry is coming back to Florida. You have 17 new companies that have launched in the last 24 months. Rates are going to come down. The challenge in Florida is rates are so much tied to reinsurance, and reinsurance is Bermuda and London, and they basically reprice every year and on kind of June 1st of every year. And so overall rates will start coming down. Obviously, no storms in Florida this year, incredibly positive. I think reinsurance rates will come down 15 to 20% next year, and people should see their rates adjusting correspondingly. So I think it's overwhelmingly positive what's going on the property insurance side. For Florida, you have 17 new companies. That's new competition entering the Florida marketplace. And you can look across the board, and whether it be condos or homeowners, rates are under pressure in getting much more commercial and competitive in the property insurance space.
And actually, just if I can
Yes,
add to that, on insurance in general, auto insurance is getting a lot better here in the state of Florida. We have an excess profit statute in the state, and Progressive has just announced that they're giving $1 billion back to policyholders in terms of rebates. State Farm is set to reduce their policies across the board by about 10% on average. So to the senator's point, the insurance market is a lot better today than it was 3 years ago.
This is what happens when you rip out the trial bar out of the insurance equation. And that was what was driving this. If you went back to 2022, Florida was 8% of U.S. property claims. We were 80% of litigation. You can't be the most hurricane-prone state and the most litigious state and expect to pay low property insurance fees.
Actually, I want to just go back to your original question
Yes, sir.
about inflation. What some people just fail to realize is that the insurance premiums are based upon two things: a replacement cost and rates, right? So as the inflationary pressures come with the overspending of the federal government, because we went through a time there where we said double-digit inflationary pressures, building materials kept on going up, the cost to construct homes went up. So the inflationary pressures that were coming upon the state of Florida, including the supply-demand issues, normal economic issues, caused the replacement costs for all these homes to go up over the past 5 years. So the same pressures that contributed to real estate taxes going up contributed to insurance premiums going up. Now, we did a lot of work in the legislature with tort reform, which helped with the rates, the multiplier that was assigned to the replacement costs. But to your point, the inflationary pressures did cause some of this problem with insurance and with property taxes at the same time.
So let me dive into a few more audience questions here. One of the questions is talking about, again, the affordability issue. So shouldn't tax relief be targeted to people with low to moderate incomes? And any proposals to eliminate taxes on homesteaded properties would also include wealthy Floridians. I think we've talked about that a little bit. Any further comments, Esteban?
Yeah, but I do think that is part of the conversation, because we do need property tax reform. We should carve out individuals who are struggling the most. I mentioned that the United Way estimates that it's 47% of people can't afford the basic necessities of living in the state. Are we targeting them? That's more efficient and cost effective if we start looking at proposals that start looking at that population. I even saw, so there's a proposal in the legislature that looks at 65-year-olds. Not every 65-year-old in the state is cost burden. About 30%, according to Schimberg Institute, a UF says 30% are cost burden. We should target them. How do we create a program, whether it's, oftentimes they call it a circuit breaker? How do we stop the surge of property taxes beyond a level for individuals who earn below a certain amount of income? That's who we should be targeting. Are we worried about first-time home buyers? We should be targeting them as well. There's different ways that we can do this as opposed to a blanket one-size-fits-all proposal, because one-size-fits-all proposals are inefficient. They're ineffective because they don't touch those caveats or nuances And then there's other things we could be doing. You could do a state level earned income tax credit. That's a shameless plug because I've been pushing for this for 5 years already. A state earned income tax credit, a working employer's rebate, tax rebate for families that have their earned income tax credit. They're working, they're not making above a certain level. You can boost them. 20% helps 2 million households in the state with an average rebate of $500. That's one way to offer some help. There's other creative solutions. I'm taking up the space here. I know Senator Brandi's had his mic up, but that's some of my ideas. I mean, there's other things we could do, but we should definitely make it targeted.
Senator.
I was just going to say, I think all of his ideas are worth a study. Unfortunately, we didn't get a study. And I think this is the challenge that we run into is we should lay all the options on the table and we should select from the ones that are fair and flat and incentivize the things that we want to incentivize. The challenge that we have right now is we're left defending this concept, which really isn't a plan, right? We're left defending a bumper sticker and not a policy. And that's not the way that we should debate tax policy. Listen, if you went to the doctor and he said, listen, we know we're planning to cut out this organ, but we could do a study to figure out what would happen if we did that, but we're not planning to do that. We're just going to cut it out and see what happens. You would call that malpractice, right? But at the end of the day, what do we have going on in Florida? We have the governor who says, we're going to rip out the foundation of this house. We're going to rip out this organ. And now we aren't going to tell you what's going to happen afterwards. And somehow that's not malpractice. It is malpractice. This is policy malpractice, not medical malpractice. But at the end of the day, that's what we're debating here.
Yes, sir.
One other thing I want to add is that all elected officials are done with the consent of the governed. And every survey poll that I have seen over the last 3 months have said that the idea of property tax reform, including the elimination of property taxes on homesteaded properties, is overwhelmingly popular. Upwards around 73% of people would pass something that would give themselves a big property tax cut. So when we're thinking about this, we also have to come to the realization that it's not government's money, it's the people's money. And if you are truly going to live by the motto that you are going to get elected with the consent of the governed, if the governed says 70% of the people think we should have serious property tax reform, maybe we should listen to them.
We touched on this a little bit before about the Colorado Taxpayers Bill of Rights, or the TABOR. Model for sustainable tax restraint is the terminology. Can any of you talk a little bit more about that model and how it potentially could impact Florida?
Yeah, look, I'm a fan. I've had conversations and phone calls with Dan Mitchell, then previously at the Cato Institute, on how they do that. At one point, I tried to propose something when I was in the House that would be similar. I actually think that there should be a taxpayer bill of rights in local government as well as state government, curbing the growth of government itself to not grow any larger than inflation and population growth. It's a way to have a constitutional constraint on government itself. It has worked very well for Colorado, and I think it could work well here.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about that?
Agree. I think it's a good idea to look at for local governments. The Constitution has a limitation on state growth. It hasn't come into effect. I think we still have like a $32 billion cushion in current fiscal year. So, but something similar is something to be looked at.
Okay. Esteban, do you want to comment?
Yeah, at the state level, we use personal income and inflation. Personal income and population growth, not inflation. Right. Is that correct? Yeah, it's personal income. So I guess it brings up the same issues. Why, if you're in this tax expenditure limit conversations, why would you use inflation and population and not have more, I think, be more methodical about it? And I'm just talking broadly now, generally speaking, with some of the concerns. I don't think inflation, the consumer price index, gets you there. If we're talking about like what a hypothetical level of growth should be for government, I think you can start to break it up. Look at it, look at energy costs, look at the cost of health and care, look at all those things. Then maybe that gets you closer. But I don't think a simple inflation plus population gets you there because I already mentioned it, so I don't need to kind of go into detail again, but I think it leaves too much. It's not exact, and it doesn't give you, I don't think it gives you the right measure for how much government should grow by, particularly when you look at different measures. If we use personal income at state level, personal income has increased by 100%, around 100% over the past 10 years. That's way above inflation and population growth. Market value, 155%. You start to look at those different measures and you start to realize, okay, well, that changes the calculation. So I do think we have to be careful. And when you look at Colorado or you look at California, other places that have instituted like severe limits on how much local governments can take in, it's cost local governments and it's cost taxpayers. And I do think we should listen to the people who are governed. I love that. We the people, right? For the people, by the people. If you look at Florida, ask individuals how often they'll raise their own taxes for public services at the local level. 75% of times, they will vote to increase their own taxes because of the services they're getting at the local level. No, it's not just fire and police. It also includes infrastructure. You have to find it, but it could be just fire and police. Let's say, but it also includes other infrastructure and other referenda that you have at the local level. I believe TaxWatch has a study on this. People don't mind getting taxed when they see the benefits, and the benefits are at the local level. And if you get rid of property taxes, you're going to lose some of that.
Well, I think the challenge that I have with the poll numbers that the CFO came out with was, what question would we ask? Right? If I just come out and said, hey, listen, who wants to cut their property taxes? Boy, everybody said, whoa, sure, absolutely. But if I don't tell you the other half of the equation, when we're going to raise X, when we're going to turn your cities and counties into dependents, which have to go ask Tallahassee for money to hire police and firefighters or to fill potholes every year, then maybe we get a different answer. I think the question is, how are we asking the question? What is the question? And is it transparent? And what we've here and what we've seen here and what the governor has failed to produce, other than a bumper sticker, is a plan. And that's not fair. It's not fair to ask you what you think about a bumper sticker and not the full proposal.
Yes, sir.
This is why I know that number is solid, is that when you get your property tax bill, it is very personal. You get to see the amount of money that you're paying. And to your point, they are increasing taxes every year by keeping the millage rate the same, which is a tax increase. But then they're being told by politicians that they kept the millage rate the same, that they're good stewards of your tax dollars, which I think, basic numbers and projections and shows you how much that they've grown over the past 5 years would show that they are not. But for the people who are receiving that tax bill and seeing how much their taxes have grown, especially over the past 5 years, are asking themselves the question, are the services that I am getting commensurate and worth the taxes that I'm paying? And I think most people, 3/4 of the people of the state of Florida, according to polls, are saying no, that they want that tax bill cut. They want it to go back to at least the very original intent of shielding a third of your home from property taxation. And we are far from that right now. And that's why people are feeling the pinch.
And this is the problem with the plan, right? Everybody gets a tax bill today, and it shows, not renters, but homeowners get a tax bill today. You know what? And when they get upset, they get a chance to go to their local governments and complain about that. Nobody complains. Nobody comes to their local governments and says, boy, I paid way too much sales tax this year, right? Because it's totally amorphous. Right? It's a nebulous concept, this sales tax. I pay it. Yes, sure. I pay it at the counter, but I don't get a bill for it or a receipt for it that shows me what I paid every year. This is the thing about property taxes, is at the end of the day, at the end of the year, you get a property tax bill. And if you're upset about it, you can go to your local governments and you can argue about it. And you can say it's too high and I want it lower. But if we go through with this plan and we raise sales tax 3%, and the millage goes up and therefore rents go up, a third of your renters are going to get double whammied. And you know what? They're not going to have a property tax bill to go to their local governments and fight about. They're not going to have an ability to complain to their local governments, because you know what? A lot of that they don't see. They just know that the $60 or $100 or $200 extra that they're paying every single month is not showing up in their bank accounts.
But that's why spending constraint is so important. And look, I agree that Senator Brandis, that the first impulse from local government is going to raise the millage rate on non-homesteaded properties. And right now there is a 10% cap that they can't go higher than that. On homesteaded properties, it's 3%. On non-homesteaded properties, 10%. I think that's too much. So if we're really worried about protecting renters, we should lower that also to 3%. Put more constraints on local government in order to constrain what they're actually spending. But here's the other thing I want everyone to realize, is that anyone who understands business knows that there are two sides of an equation. You have your P&L, you have your profit and loss statement. For all intents and purposes, our profit and loss statement that we're discussing right now is the revenue coming in from property taxes, sales taxes, CST, local option sales taxes. That's the revenue that local governments are bringing in order to fund their general fund budget. The other side of that is the expenses that they pay out, right? No one's talking about the balance sheet of these local governments. I'm telling you right now, your local governments are sitting on mountains and mountains of cash that they have accumulated over decades and decades of taxation, where they take a buffer roughly around 10% every year and sock it away, and they build it up. How do you think they got past the last property tax reform that was done in 2008, 2009? Their revenues did not meet their expenses. They were drawing down some of the mountain of cash that they had. I will tell you that I've personally seen numerous, way too many to speak of, local governments sit there and cry poor that they need to raise taxes in terms of millage rates, to have a referendum on the ballot in order to raise a local option sales tax, because according to their P&L, they needed to raise more revenue, but they're sitting on a mountain of cash over here. How do I know that? Because I was a legislator for 11 years. And I would have people that represent these local governments, lobbyists or local government people themselves, whether it was a mayor or a county commissioner, come in and say, hey, we want to put an appropriation for us. Okay, we'll entertain it. Let's talk. Well, the total project is going to be $20 million, but I got great news. This is what the government was saying. I got great news. We only need $10 million because we're putting in $10 million yourself. I'm like, wait, you have $10 million, but then you're sitting there and you want to tax your people even more, go to the referendum because you're crying poor, but you have all this extra money? Another side project, another thing that we should consider is not just the P&L and the balance sheet part of it, but if local governments are overspending and not being good stewards of your tax dollars now, they still go to the legislature every year and ask for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from the state government in order to supplement and augment what they're spending locally. So if we find that your local government is wasting money, your tax dollars, and not being efficient, not being frugal, then Tallahassee shouldn't sit there and allow you to double down on wasteful spending. So I would argue if we right-size local governments, get them with some sort of fiscal constraint, there would be more money at the state level also.
Do you want to comment, Brandi?
I would just say that you can go to TaxWatch's Turkey report to see a lot of projects that get funded to local governments every year.
Okay. With our last few minutes here, just a couple more questions that have come in while we're wrapping up here. One of the questions has to do with taxing private equity firms that own Florida properties at a higher rate. Is that something that should be considered?
You're talking about corporate ownership of rentals.
Correct.
This vast majority of rentals are owned by individuals who own one or two or three properties, not corporate rentals. And how you would go out and determine that, most of these larger corporations, they create a separate LLC for every few homes. And so it would be very difficult to track all of that down in a simple, straightforward way. And frankly, what you would end up doing is just punishing the wrong people. If you just said all corporate rentals have to pay an increased tax, you would be punishing renters.
Okay. Any other comments on that question? Let me go to one more here.
I'm not an expert in that area. I will say for the ones that are using subsidiaries in other states or in other countries, you could close some corporate income tax loopholes at the state level. Right now we allow corporations to basically lower their property tax burden, their corporate income tax burden in the state of Florida. It's not, again, this is some property taxes, but there are some things we could do if we're worried about corporations coming and not paying their full tax bill in the state of Florida.
Okay, here's another one. How far can we assume the market correction for the real estate must achieve in order to correct the inadequacy of property taxes? Anybody want?
I don't think
stab
you
at
can
that?
quantify that. I would leave it up to the bean counters over here, the one that crunch the numbers.
The policy expert? Okay. Let me go to one more here. Should Florida require combined reporting for businesses? Let's see, sorry, it just disappeared. So required reporting for businesses, would the recovered revenue help cover the decrease in public dollars from abolishing property taxes?
So if you were to require, right now we have this thing called separate reporting. So when we're levying corporate income tax in the state of Florida, we don't necessarily ask corporations to provide their full operation. We just say, okay, well, what did you do in Florida? Which allows them to shift profits to subsidiaries elsewhere. With combined reporting, you basically just say, well, give me a whole snapshot of your operation, and then we can apportion exactly what was in Florida. You do that, you raise around $2.4 billion annually. It's not enough to cover, 18, $19 billion, but $2.4 billion could go to a more targeted approach to property tax reform.
All right, give you all opportunity to make some final thoughts. We'll start with you, Senator Brandis.
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think the challenge that you see up here is there is no plan to criticize. There is a bumper sticker proposal to criticize, but the governor will not show what the plan is. Refuses, has a year to do it, and has refused to put the plan on the table. Has refused to, as the CFO says, show you the other side of the equation. And that leaves us debating an unknown. We don't know what the reaction, how cities and counties are going to react, because we don't know what the plan is. The simple truth is we're left to debate something that's almost undebatable because we don't know how to adjust or how cities and counties are going to adjust the proposal. What you've seen the Florida House do is want to get it off its table. And so what they did is what I call spaghetti politics. Throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. At the end of the day, the Senate's not going to let all of those 8 proposals go on the ballot. We know that. You've had the governor come out and say, I'm going to put this on the ballot. Well, the governor, unfortunately, in this case, doesn't get a say. The House and Senate get a say. And if 3/5 of the House and Senate vote on whatever proposal will go on the ballot, that's what goes on the ballot. It's not subject to veto. It's not subject even to his oversight. It is a check and balance on our governing powers. And so he doesn't get a chance to say what goes on the ballot. He can call them back in special session, and after special session after special session, I guarantee you the Florida House and the Florida Senate are not going to hand a dumpster fire to their future speakers and Senate presidents. It's not going to happen. Local governments are going to react violently if we end up with a property tax proposal that removes all of the homesteaded properties. How are they going to react? They're going to raise millage. They're going to raise their sales tax. You're going to pay for it one way or the other, and it's going to be a heck of a lot less transparent than it is today. We have a choice to make. We have options on the table. You've heard about many of those options today. Those options deserve a study. They deserve not to be considered malpractice, because what we're doing right now is practicing political malpractice by not telling you what's on the other side of that equation.
Mr. CFO.
Well, the first thing I would say is that we do not have, as of yet, one proposal that is being proposed that we can look at. I assume those proposals will be coming. I'm not a member of the legislature, but what I am thankful for is that we are actually having a conversation about this because property tax reform is long overdue. What you were talking about unknowns, Senator, but what I do know is this. What are the knowns? The knowns is that government has expanded and to the tune of local governments anywhere between 60 to 120% of the general fund budget over the last 5 years. That is undeniable. That's the numbers of the numbers. They are fast out. They were very quickly outstripping the budgets that would have normally been indexed for inflation and population. They're taking the extra tax dollars and they're expanding government. What I do know also is that families are hurting. especially younger families. They don't have an opportunity to have the American dream here in the state of Florida with property taxes so high because the barriers of entry not only are now property down payment, but now property taxes. And we need to get this right. In my opinion, we need to get this right. We need to have some sort of property tax reform that will be long lasting, that does for the people of the state of Florida what was the original intent to be, is that your home should not be a windfall for state government. It should be a vehicle to build up equity, to build up some wealth that you can do with something later. The idea that we are taxing unrealized gains, which is basically what we're doing, is something that a socialist senator in Congress would propose. That's basically what we're doing, is we are taxing unrealized gains. There's no other way around it. We have to get to the point where something is more equitable, something is fairer, maybe flatter, or disappears altogether. Because if we don't get this right now, we're going to have this conversation again 20 years from now, and we're going to wonder why we keep on missing the boat. So I'm just thankful and happy that we're actually having this conversation now.
Esteban?
If we do full elimination, that would essentially just be a gift to Floridians who are already doing well, the wealthy, and it's going to be a cost shift for everyone else. Our tax code is inequitable because we tax Floridians who are making less than $60,000 more so than a millionaire as a percentage of their own income. That's effective tax rates. That's just how it works because we rely on sales taxes and we rely on property taxes. We can make adjustments, but eliminating it will simply just shift the tax burden onto individuals who don't have it and benefit the wealthy. That's not real tax reform. I do think Floridians need real tax reform. So going into this, let's do a targeted approach to property taxes. Sure, let's have a study. I think that is necessary, but let's focus on individuals who are struggling, those 50% of families that really can't afford to live here. Those are the individuals we should be targeting, and those are the individuals we leave out of our tax code. We don't typically do anything to help them. So we do need tax reform, but it's not full elimination. That's simply not it.
And last but not least, Brandi, you started us off, so you got to wrap it up.
I think it's a worthy conversation to have. Tax levies are growing at an unsustainable pace. We need to help new homeowners. We need to help families get in homes. But I think with a little bit of what everybody said, it has to be a partnership between local, state, everybody on board to know how critical government services will be funded.
Thank you. I want to thank the audience that joined us here and also our online audience, which is over 100 people. So appreciate you all joining. If you want a copy or to relook at this discussion, it will be posted on our website within the next week. You could go to usf.edu/public-policy-events, and we will post this entire discussion here. I would want to say thank you all to our distinguished panelists and ask for a round of applause for them for their coming out tonight.
Thank you.
And if you enjoy this event, we'll keep you on the email list and look for our next debatable event in the spring semester. So stay tuned, and thank you all for joining us.